This man is the hardest gangster to kill in Ireland. Michael 9 Lives Frazer has survived at least 7 assassination attempts. He was shot, hunted across Dublin, and even survived a grenade attack. But no matter how many times his enemies tried to kill him, Mickey 9 Lives always walked away alive. Michael Frazer was born and raised in a tough working-class district of Dublin. As a teenager in the late 1990s, he fell in with a crowd of local youths who were already dabbling in petty crime, the usual script of stealing cars, joyriding, and low-level drug dealing. By the early 2000s, he had graduated from minor delinquency to more serious criminal activity, gaining a reputation on the streets as an ambitious young operator, unafraid to get his hands dirty. This period also saw Frazer forging key alliances that would define his early criminal career. He became closely associated with Fat Freddie Thompson, a childhood friend, or at least a fellow young gangster from the Crumlin area of Dublin. Thompson, born in 1980 and raised in the same South Inner City area, was quickly rising to prominence as a ruthless gangland figure. In the early 2000s, Thompson emerged as a leader of one side of the infamous Crumlin-Drimnagh feud, a bloody gang war that erupted after a split among former friends over a missing drug shipment. The feud pitted Thompson's faction against that of rival kingpin Brian "King Rat" Rattigan, resulting in at least 16 murders over the next decade. Growing up amid this conflict, Frazer was drawn directly into the chaos. As an associate of Fat Freddie Thompson, he effectively chose a side in the feud and therefore inherited a long list of enemies. By his mid-20s, Frazer was reportedly involved in drug distribution in Dublin's South City, learning the ropes of the underworld. Frazer managed to stay alive and free through the worst years of that war. No small feat, considering many of his peers ended up either dead or in prison. It was during these early years that Frazer developed a close relationship not only with Thompson, but also with other senior figures in the Dublin underworld. One such figure was Paul Rice, a veteran Tallaght gangster with a formidable reputation. Rice, significantly older and more experienced, had been involved in organized crime since the 1990s and became something of a mentor to the younger generation. Through Thompson's network, Frazer came under the influence of Rice as well, absorbing the lessons of a previous generation of criminals. After 2008, Michael Frazer's stature in the underworld began to rise. The bloody Crumlin-Drimnagh feud had started to fade. The rival Rattigan faction had been weakened by killings and key imprisonments. With many of his enemies gone or in retreat, Frazer found new space to operate. Freddie Thompson's side was effectively the victor of the feud, and as one of Thompson's trusted associates, Frazer stood to benefit. During 2008 to 2013, he was reportedly involved in the cocaine and cannabis trade that flowed into Dublin's neighborhoods, leveraging the supply lines that had been established during the feud. International links, possibly via contacts in Spain or the Netherlands, provided narcotics, which Frazer and his crew distributed locally for hefty profits. While concrete evidence of his specific enterprises is scarce, authorities reportedly pegged Frazer as a significant player in organized crime by the early 2010s. However, success in the criminal underworld often breeds internal friction. As Frazer became more assertive and financially independent, tensions grew between himself, Fat Freddie Thompson, and Paul Rice. The period from about 2011 to 2013 saw a splintering of alliances that had once been solid. By many accounts, Frazer began to distance himself from Thompson's direct control. One unverified report suggests a heated confrontation occurred at a Dublin nightclub in late 2012, where Frazer and Thompson clashed over a failed drug deal. Whether or not that specific tale is true, it's clear that by 2013, their long-standing partnership had soured. Paul Rice had been an ally of Thompson's enterprise and likely saw Frazer as a protege at first. But as Frazer pushed for more, Rice's attitude reportedly shifted. A man of Rice's standing, would not take kindly to a junior asserting independence. The exact incidents leading to the final rift remain murky, as neither side spoke openly, and much comes from underworld gossip rather than official record. Thompson, who by then had aligned himself closely with the burgeoning Kinahan cartel. Up to 2013, Frazer had no serious criminal convictions on record, despite over a decade in the game. Authorities attempted on multiple occasions to pin charges on him. Rumors suggest he was questioned about a major drug seizure in 2012 and was also a person of interest in a gang-related shooting that year, but nothing stuck. 2014 would prove to be a harrowing year for Michael Frazer, a year in which he earned the moniker Mickey 9 Lives by surviving one attempt on his life after another. With his split from Fat Freddie Thompson and Paul Rice, Frazer suddenly found himself at the top of Dublin's underworld hit list. Former allies had turned into vengeful enemies. According to Garda intelligence, at least 3 serious hit bids were made against Frazer in 2014 alone. It seemed that Thompson's faction had decided that Frazer needed to be eliminated for his perceived betrayal. The first known assassination attempt came in the spring of 2014 and nearly succeeded.
A man in his 30s has been shot and seriously injured in Dublin tonight. He was shot a number of times in the car park of Bono Church in Clondalkin. He's in a critical condition in hospital.
Well, Eileen, Gardaí say the victim is known to them. He's a man in his 30s and he's connected to one of 2 feuding Crumlin-Drimnagh criminal gangs. Now, at around 6:15 this evening, he staggered into Clondalkin Garda station and collapsed. He had sustained gunshot wounds to the neck and upper body. He was taken to Tala Hospital, where he's in a critical condition tonight. Investigating Gardaí then discovered that he'd been shot in the church car park of Bono Church. Now, the church has been sealed off and the Garda station, Clondalkin Garda station, has also been sealed off. There are 2 crime scenes tonight, and Gardaí are continuing their investigation. They're treating it as attempted murder. They believe at this stage that the victim could have been shot because he's believed to be involved in a feud with a well-known Clondalkin criminal.
He had just gotten into his vehicle when a hit team struck. Frazer was shot twice, suffering bullet wounds to his body. Bleeding and in pain, he managed a desperate escape, slamming his car into gear and speeding away from the scene. He drove straight to the nearest Garda station seeking sanctuary. At the Garda station, Frazer was given medical assistance for his wounds. However, when detectives tried to question him about the incident, he refused to cooperate. He wouldn't name his attackers or even describe what happened. He went so far as to refuse police access to his medical records from the hospital treatment. This stonewalling meant that authorities had to rely on their own detective work to solve the case. In this instance, they caught a break. The gunman who shot Frazer turned out to be James Nellie Walsh, a young associate of Thompson. In a twist almost darkly comedic, Walsh actually shot himself in the leg while fleeing the scene that day, leaving behind forensic evidence. Within months, Walsh was arrested and charged. To avoid a full trial, he eventually pleaded guilty to possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, and the more serious charge of attempted murder of Frazer was dropped as part of the plea deal. Walsh received a 10-year prison sentence for the botched hit. While the March 2014 shooting was the most documented attempt on Frazer that year, it was far from the last. In the wake of Walsh's failed hit, Frazer's enemies did not relent. At least 2 more attempts on his life unfolded in 2014. The details of these incidents are less public. In one reported instance, gunmen opened fire on a car they believed Frazer was traveling in, only to find their information was bad. Frazer wasn't in that vehicle. On another occasion, a pair of masked attackers tried to corner him outside a friend's residence, riddling the area with bullets. Miraculously, Frazer escaped yet again. Each time, he refused to make statements to police, so reliable information is scarce. But authorities believed that Thompson's crew was systematically hunting Frazer throughout that year, determined to get rid of him. By 2014, he was relatively isolated without the backing of a larger gang, so launching into a feud of his own against Thompson would be a poor move. Frazer's priority was survival. He kept a low profile and moved carefully. Associates say Frazer switched cars frequently and may have even worn body armor on occasion. After surviving 2 or 3 near-death experiences in a matter of months, he became extremely paranoid. By the end of 2014, Frazer had already survived more attempts on his life in 1 year than most gangsters might in a lifetime. The newspapers hadn't yet splashed his name widely. He was known in the criminal underworld, and the authorities certainly knew him. Within gangland circles, however, his near misses were legendary, earning him that nickname, 9 Lives. By early 2015, according to Underworld Whispers, Frazer had survived 5 separate assassination attempts by this point. After the 5th hit attempt was narrowly dodged, Frazer finally made the life-saving decision. He fled Ireland. The exact timeline of Frazer's departure is not public, but sources indicate that at some stage in 2015, he packed his bags and went into exile. After escaping to the UK, the trail suggests Frazer moved further afield, in Europe. Spain is often a destination for fleeing Irish gangsters, ironically nicknamed the Costa del Crime, for its history of harboring fugitives. There were unconfirmed sightings of a man resembling Michael Frazer in the Costa del Sol in late 2015, mingling in the Irish pubs frequented by exiled criminals. It would have been a risky choice. Spain was, after all, home base for the Kinahan cartel, effectively the same network that wanted him dead. For about 2 years, Frazer lived in this limbo. By 2016, the landscape in Dublin's underworld began shifting dramatically due to another feud, the explosive Kinahan-Hutch feud, which was consuming the attention of his would-be assassins. Frazer must have watched these developments from afar, and at some point, he judged that the scales might have tilted enough in his favor to attempt a return. Little did he know that even in exile, he wasn't completely out of danger, and that 2017 would bring new attempts on his life. Michael Frazer had cautiously returned to Irish soil. His return would see 2 more assassination plots on his life. This time, however, law enforcement was watching closely, and the backdrop of Dublin's gangland had changed in ways that, ironically, helped Frazer survive yet again. The first incident came in May 2017. Gunmen attacked Michael Frazer's residence in Drimnagh, South Dublin. Under cover of darkness one night, a vehicle sped past Frazer's house, and at least one shooter opened fire with a handgun, blasting the property with a volley of bullets. At least 7 shots were fired into the house. Luckily, neither Frazer nor anyone else was hit in this spray of gunfire. All signs pointed to Fat Freddie Thompson, Frazer's old friend turned foe. Reports later emerged that Thompson, who by then was back on the streets after a 20-month prison stint for violent disorder, had a personal hand in this vengeance attempt. There was talk of a personal row between Thompson and Frazer that had never been settled. Even after a couple of years, Thompson's grudge hadn't faded. In fact, Thompson's own position had evolved. He was now closely aligned with the Kinahan cartel's campaign against the Hutch family, and he had access to plenty of willing gunmen. It seems Thompson leveraged those resources to target Frazer. August 2017 nearly brought his saga to an end, but in a dramatic turn, this attempt was thwarted by law enforcement in real time. The authorities were deeply invested in cracking down on gangland violence due to the escalating Kinahan-Hutch feud. This meant unprecedented surveillance and intelligence efforts targeting key cartel figures and their hitmen. Frazer, as a known target of the Kinahan-Thompson faction, indirectly benefited from this increased police scrutiny on the gangs. In late July 2017, Garda detectives received confidential intelligence that a hit was being organized on a man in Drimnagh, that man being Michael Frazer. They identified suspected operatives and even a vehicle, a white transit van, that the hit team intended to use. Authorities covertly placed a recording device and GPS tracker in the assassin's van. They had the vehicle under constant surveillance as it moved around the city. The would-be hitmen, later identified as Stephen Dunn and Gary Gleeson, were heard discussing their murderous plans, unaware that every word was being recorded inside the bugged van.
A special criminal court has heard how Gardaí intercepted 2 hitmen on their way to carry out a contract killing following a surveillance operation. 34-year-old Gary Gleeson from Muskerry Road in Ballyfermot and 39-year-old Stephen Dunn from Mela Unree Drive in Lucan were described as foot soldiers who were hired by senior crime figures to kill another man.
On the 7th of August, they knew something significant was being planned and that the men had a loaded firearm in the van. Then, using audio surveillance, they heard exactly what was planned. They heard Gary Gleeson tell Stephen Dunn to aim for the head. He said, "Headshots, or we won't get effing paid." Dunn describes how he'll shoot once, then keep walking right up to the windscreen and keep shooting. Gleeson then says, "Riddle him." Defence barristers told the court that both men had chronic drug problems and were in debt. They were described as hired hands or foot soldiers contracted by senior crime figures to kill another man on an internal matter. They were cogs in the wheel, but were not the masterminds. Both men were originally charged with conspiracy to murder, but they later pleaded guilty to lesser charges of possession of a firearm and ammunition with intent to endanger life. The plea was accepted by the state and they'll be sentenced at a later date.
In the aftermath, details of this foiled plot came to light in court proceedings. It emerged that the Kinahan cartel was indeed behind the contract. Investigators believe that Daniel Kinahan or his lieutenants had sanctioned the hit on Frazer, possibly as a favour to Thompson, or simply to eliminate a loose end from the past. Frazer's survival and non-cooperation made him an enigma, not actively in their way, but a man who had defied them and lived, which perhaps they saw as an unacceptable precedent. Garda sources revealed that the hitmen were chosen because they owed money to the cartel and were desperate enough to take on the job. After surviving the 2017 attempts on his life, Michael Frazer effectively went low profile. Remarkably, in the years following, Frazer managed to outlive or outlast many of the underworld figures who had once posed the greatest threats to him. Among these was Fat Freddie Thompson, the man who had arguably been the prime mover behind multiple attempts on Frazer's life, met his downfall not at Frazer's hand, but through his own involvement in another feud. In August 2018, Thompson was convicted of murder for his role in the killing of David Douglas, a Hutch associate, and was sentenced to life in prison. With Thompson now caged for life, Frazer's most vendetta-driven enemy was permanently removed from the streets. Another major enemy, the Kinahan cartel, also faced significant setbacks around this time. While the Kinahan leadership, like Daniel Kinahan, remained out of reach abroad, their Dublin operations were severely disrupted by police action and the Hutch feud's toll. Key Kinahan hitmen and lieutenants were taken down. James Nellie Walsh, the hitman who had shot Frazer in March 2014, spent most of the decade behind bars for that botched job. He was released around 2022, but almost immediately landed in trouble again. In a poetic turn of events, Walsh himself became the target of assassination attempts by other criminals and was lucky to survive a machine gun attack shortly after getting out of prison. Paul Rice, the veteran gangster who once sided against Frazer, also faded from prominence. While not as publicly documented, Rice by the late 2000s and 10s was an aging figure. There were reports of health issues and a retreat from active gangland involvement. He did not appear to pose an active threat to Frazer anymore. With Thompson gone and the Kinahans on the ropes, Rice had little incentive or backing to pursue an old vendetta. By around 2019, Michael "Mickey 9 Lives" Frazer found himself in an unusual situation. He had outlived the storm. As of 2025, Michael is believed to be alive, in his mid to late 40s, and still keeping to the quiet life he adopted in recent years. Publicly, he remains an enigmatic figure. Those familiar with Dublin's gangland scene say that Frazer has aged out of the game. After decades in the underworld and multiple brushes with death, he appears content to stay out of any spotlight.